So, Stonewielder and Existentialism. First, an amateur's recap of the main points that we are going to use to interpret this book by Ian C. Esslemont, the third, the novel of the Malazan Empire. We start with Sartre. In Being and Nothingness, there are important points that he lays out that will go on to define the existentialist movement in philosophy. With Descartes, we have this trend in philosophy to frame things as essence precedes existence. I think, therefore I am. What Sartre will reply with is that no, actually, it is existence that precedes essence, namely, if we can define such a thing as the essence of an individual, it is shaped by their experiences, like their struggles in life, by their social context. It is what they live and how they live that shape their essence, and not the other way around. The next point proposed by Sartre is men, are doomed to be free. They are condemned to be free. They cannot escape. And of course, the next one is the fact that this is so often a misunderstood point about existentialism. Yes, existence has no intrinsic meaning, but what Sartre will argue is that humans are morally compelled to feel that meaning for themselves. That is, to give themselves the meaning, define their own meaning in existence. So there's no intrinsic meaning to existence, but humans are compelled to feel it by themselves. And this comes coupled with the notion of freedom. Now that's for Sartre. De Beauvoir will go on and develop an entire existentialist ethic, a study of the ethical exploration with these principles laid out by Sartre, which are more ontological. She frames an ethics based on the embrace of this freedom. And she goes on to define what one will define as individuals that live their lives from an existentialist perspective in an unethical way, by rejecting this freedom in one way or another. So we have a spectrum. Every human being is composed of two aspects within this theory, within this context. There is our facticity, the concrete things that we are, and as well as the background context in which we exist, and our transcendence, the potentialities, what we might become, what we could become. In her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, de Beauvoir will go on to sketch how this ambiguity, as well as others, of course, it is in this tension, in this contradiction that the human condition arises. And she then goes on to enumerate ways in which individuals renounce this freedom or abuse it. In one end of the spectrum is somebody that sees all this freedom and rejects it. Is afraid of so much freedom, of the responsibility that comes associated with it. And then this individual will just sustain the status quo, embrace whatever set of values the background in which they exist has whatever values or structures in terms of morality their background has, their culture, their institutions, depends. On the other hand, on the other extreme, not extreme because after them we have the nihilist, we have an individual that embraces freedom but is so paralyzed by the sheer number of possibilities of what they might become that they end up with inaction. Nothing interests them. They can't accept anything because they have accepted everything. And it is within this context that we go to Stonewielder. And I'm going to synthesize the book in 3 characters. I know there's much more in there. But on the one hand, we have him, Lord Protector of Coral, commander of the Stormguard. This is the first case we mentioned. This is somebody that is absolutely certain of what he's doing, but it is just because he essentially inherited all his beliefs, all his ethics from the institution to which he has devoted most of his life, the Stormguard. Notice that in this worldview, there's no room from an epistemological perspective to disabuse oneself from notions that are simply wrong. This is a self-supporting system with no way out. So, for instance, we have him. He felt as if his heart were squeezing to a knot in his chest. And then he thought, that is my regret, that I will share no more time with my brothers. These are the best men. Our cause is just, and our hearts are pure. That is the voice. It's not so much of a fanatic. It's the voice of somebody that has completely embraced this mindset that has no way out. And then you use values, the values of institutions, to justify all you do. So there's no responsibility because I didn't make a choice. I'm just doing what I know, what I have always known is right. Of course, later in the book we have the revelation. Of course, Him thinks he's saving all of Coral by standing the wall. And there the lady reveals to himself and speak. Did you not die for me? Do so now. And then the lady's presence snapped away, leaving him reeling. His mind couldn't catch at anything. His hands went to his neck. He thought, all this time, then all this time. No, it was too terrible to contemplate, too horrific, a monstrous crime. This is when it is revealed that essentially the storm wall is a massive center of blood sacrifice for the lady and for her protection, not for the protection of any land, but just of her. And it is here that it is revealed that all his worldview has been a lie. Now, I personally didn't like him, but I think he's, at his core, a decent person. And this is how we see how systems take people to do this kind of atrocities. In real life, the people with this kind of zeal, even when they're confronted with the wrong, they never accept it. But Esslemont gives us this closure of him accepting that. But of course he can bear it. And he has to end his life. Not by sacrificing himself to the lady, but by jumping into the seas Of course, one could argue that in doing so, he's embracing freedom. That's debatable. He's killing himself, and at least existentialism has some issues with taking that route. Next, and in some ways the contrasting image of him, we have Ivanar. This is a guy that, he was champion of the Ruby and Just. He resigned to that. He swore never to kill again. And of course, he's been entrusted this task of becoming the successor of this polytheistic cult that is growing in Corel. Symbolically, it represents precisely that, the combination of all the possibilities, as opposed to the unity of the cult of the lady. And yet, it seems he does believe in these gods, in these foreign gods, foreign to Coreller people. But he doesn't dare to accept that. And it, to me, at least, symbolizes this rejection to all these possibilities. And it is here where I make the connection with the second individual described by de Beauvoir in her book. Of course, in the end, he's forced into that position, and he accepts his task, his role as the leader of this group, of this polytheistic cult. And yet we hear echoes of this existentialist mindset in some of the lines, and he thinks to himself, in what I think is the highest point of his character arc, only in the doing can the measure be made, and only in hindsight. To me, this sounds precisely as existence precedes essence. It is by the acts and by your choices that you can establish an essence, if it even exists. Of course, Ivanar serves as something else, not from the philosophical perspective, but from a narrative perspective. Him, I believe, is a masterful not him. Ivanar, I think, is a masterful exploration of what I would call a trope of the reluctant leader. In some narrations, books, video games, movies, series, we always tend to see leaders that have power thrown at them, and they accept it reluctantly. Kind of messaging that wishing for power is somehow wrong. But it's often left unexplored. Why don't they want power? Why will anyone be like that? And of course, Esslemont provides a satisfactory answer in my view. It's a matter of doubt. What did I do to deserve this power? What makes me worthy of it? And we see that transition through most of the novel. It explores this trope in a very interesting way, to me anyway. Of course, this has echoes through the rest of the Malazan cycle. We have these principles about ascendancy, and what we have recovered from interviews of both Erikson and Esslemont is that generally, if an individual wants to ascend, just by sheer power of will, they won't do it. There needs to be something else. They can force ascension. They cannot do it. There must be something in their nature that eventually leads to their ascension. And of course, this isn't the case of godhood and powers, magical powers, and stuff like that. But we see how Malazan embraces this trope, and then Esslemont in this particular book takes it and deconstructs it, shows why it is important why this aspect of having doubts about embracing power is it resonates so much with us. It does because at some level we feel uncomfortable about these people that will do anything to gain power. So it resonates easily, and that might be one of the reasons why the trope is effective. It must be said, I'm not using the word trope as something negative. To me, a trope is a narrative structure or feature that works and is used repeatedly precisely because it works. It achieves the effect that the writer or narrator wants to achieve. It's simple as that. As anything in writing, it can be done well or wrong, poorly or brilliantly. Simple as that. And so, to keep this short, I like to go to a third figure, Stonewielder, Greymane. Just a phrase that I think that echoes some of the stronger philosophical influences, at least in the work of Erikson. It's kind of a shout out from Esslemont to Erikson. And what a Stonewielder says, I've come to understand that the truth isn't really what's important. He cocked his head, his dull blue eyes edging back to her. That's the high priestess. The high mage, sorry. What really matters is what people come to agree is the truth. And again, this goes back to something I've discussed in some of my older videos, how agreed upon myths or fictions gain power by our common agreement that they're valid. They are really powerful. And in the Malazan universe, we know just how powerful they are. I mean, people can bring into existence entities by believing in them. And I think that's a nice shout out to what we experience in reality, where we agree upon institutions, nations, money, religions, societies, and even though they aren't real in the sense that they are not physical aspects that can be measured, they do allow us to do a lot of things, some good, some bad, but their effectiveness cannot be understated, and it must be said, it is not the same that an outright lie. It's more like a shared fiction, and it is extremely powerful. So basically that's my look at Stonewielder through an existentialist eye. Existentialism in particular is one of the philosophical movements that is closer to me. I've read about it. Of course, if you are a philosophy major, bear with me. I'm an amateur. I don't do this. I don't study philosophy professionally. I'm an engineer. I do apply mathematics. So I know this is very superficial. And finally, what I would like to say is that since I started the novels of the Malazan Empire, my impression is that as someone keeps growing as a writer, and at this point in Stonewielder, he doesn't shy away from doing not only narrative explorations, things that he did back in the Night of Knives, doing such a short book that explains so much. It was the case in Return of the Crimson Guard, but here I see a new degree of depth, let's say an authorial maturity. And I have to say, I already started the next book, Or Set to the Throne. And I really like how he has been evolving. I like this conversation between the Book of the Fallen and Esslemont's work. I do also know that there's a lot of Esslemont within the Book of the Fallen. because much of this backstory and much of this world building were commonly constructed. It's a shared world, and that's how they both put it. So I just realized that I had no books discussing, no discussions on Esslemont's book, and this one was a nice start. I wish to eventually, in some sort of joint Q&A, I can ask Erikson and Esslemont about what are their main philosophical influences for each one, because my guess will be that they're not influenced by the same philosophical movements. They might share some, but I think I can see the discrepancies, the differences between the two authors. They both embed philosophy in their works, but they have different feelings. If I go by Stonewielder, Esslemont will be the existentialist guy.